They say the dead outnumber the living. For every person alive today, there are 15 who've passed on. That thought keeps me company on long, cold nights in the morgue. I'm a forensic doctor, and the night shift is mine. My job is to examine the bodies, document the evidence, and find answers for the living. But here's something you might not know. At 3 a.m., the witching hour, morgues feel different. The air seems heavier, the silence sharper. People call it superstition, but spend a few nights here alone, and you might start to wonder, what really goes on when the clock strikes 3 a.m. in a morgue? I didn't believe in the stories, at least not until last night. The shift started as they always do. I clocked in at 10 p.m., grabbed a cup of coffee, and went straight to work. The morgue was its usual self, sterile, cold, and quiet. Just me and the bodies, all neatly arranged in their metal drawers. My workload was light. A couple of routine autopsies and some paperwork. By 1 a.m. I'd finished the last of the reports and was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails, trying to stay awake. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the room. At 2:47 a.m., the lights flickered. I frowned. The building was old, and the wiring had always been finicky. Still, it unsettled me. There's something about a flickering light in a morgue that feels wrong, like it's hinting at something you can't quite see. I tried to ignore it, sipping my now cold coffee and forcing my focus back to the screen. Then, at 2:59 a.m., I heard it. A soft click. It was faint, almost like the sound of a latch releasing. I froze, the hair on my arms standing up. The morgue was locked, and the only way in or out was through the security door behind me. No one else was supposed to be here. I glanced at the clock. 2:59. It must have been my imagination, I told myself. The building settles, machines hum, sounds happen. But then I heard it again, a low, creaking sound, like metal scraping against metal. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the source of the noise. One of the body drawers was sliding open. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. The drawer didn't slam open dramatically like in the movies. It moved slowly, almost casually, as if someone was opening it from the inside. The air grew colder. I could feel it on my skin, sharp and biting, far colder than the room had been moments before. My logical mind screamed for an explanation. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly earlier, maybe the latch had failed, but then it stopped, half open, silent, and I swear to you, I saw a hand. It was pale, mottled with the faint purplish-blue hue of death. The fingers were long and unnaturally thin, and they curled around the edge of the metal drawer like they were testing the air. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. My rational mind shouted at me to grab a scalpel, call security, anything. But my body refused to move. The hand retreated, disappearing into the darkness of the drawer. And then the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the fluorescent lights replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. My flashlight was on the desk, but I was too afraid to move. I could hear something now, faint but distinct. Breathing. It wasn't my own. I was holding my breath, frozen with fear. This was something else. Slow, deliberate, and rasping like it hadn't taken a breath in years. My eyes darted to the clock. 3:01 a.m. I reached for the flashlight with trembling fingers, the metal cold and unforgiving in my grip. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the drawer. It was empty. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the darkness, the stress, and the silence had played tricks on my mind. I moved closer, shining the light into the drawer to reassure myself. It was empty, just like it should be. The body, a middle-aged man from a car accident, wasn't there. That's when I heard the door creak. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. The morgue door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move toward the door. My breath fogged in the icy air as I reached out to close it, but before I could touch it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the room, followed by a voice, soft, whispering. "Doctor!" I froze. The word hung in the air, low and guttural, like it had been dragged from a throat that shouldn't be capable of speech. "Doctor!" it said again, louder this time. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw it, the man from the drawer standing at the far end of the room. His head was tilted unnaturally to the side, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were open, wide and unseeing, and yet I could feel them staring at me. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. When the light stopped spinning, he was gone. The lights flickered back on, humming softly as if nothing had happened. The drawer was closed, the room was empty. I ran to the security footage, desperate to confirm what I'd seen. My fingers fumbled over the keyboard as I rewound the feed. There it was, me, sitting at the desk. The lights flickering, the drawer sliding open, and then, nothing. The feed cut to static at exactly 3 a.m. and resumed at 3:03. I didn't finish my shift. I left the morgue that night and never went back. Now I lie awake wondering if it was real. If something truly happens in morgues when the clock strikes 3 a.m., Sometimes the dead don't stay where they're put. I don't normally work nights, I prefer the day shifts, patrolling office buildings or malls where the most excitement comes from chasing off loitering teenagers or dealing with a tripped alarm. But tonight was different. The regular night guard, Steve, called in sick and my boss didn't have anyone else to cover. "It's just a morgue," he said, as if that made it better. "You won't have any trouble there, the dead don't cause problems." I laughed politely, but the idea of spending the night in a morgue didn't sit right with me. Still, I needed the extra cash. So, at 10 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot of St. Vincent's Medical Center, grabbed my flashlight, and walked into the building. The morgue was in the basement, of course. Everything about it was as cliché as I imagined. Long, narrow hallways with buzzing fluorescent lights, and doors labeled with sterile, unfeeling words like autopsy and cold storage. When I got to the security desk, I saw Steve had left me a note. It was short. "Stay in the office. Don't wander. Call me if you need anything. Steve." It felt more like a warning than advice. The office was small and cramped, with a desk, a chair, and a row of monitors showing live feeds from cameras around the morgue. It smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. I settled in, trying to make myself comfortable. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you should be whispering. For the first couple of hours, nothing happened. I passed the time scrolling through my phone and sipping bad coffee from the vending machine. Then, at midnight, the monitors flickered, just for a second. A brief glitch. But it was enough to make my stomach tighten. I stared at the screens, waiting for it to happen again. The cameras showed the same sterile hallways, the same empty rooms, nothing out of place. I told myself it was just the system acting up, an old building with old equipment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At 1:15 a.m., I heard the first sound, a loud clang like metal slamming against metal. It echoed through the halls, sharp and sudden, breaking the oppressive silence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the office, my boots echoing against the tile floor. The sound had come from the cold storage room where they kept the bodies in those big metal drawers. The door to the room was slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The room was freezing, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, all shut tight. Nothing looked out of place. I was about to leave when I saw it, a single wet footprint on the tile floor. It was faint, but unmistakable. A bare footprint, the kind a person might leave after stepping out of the shower. I looked around, shining my light on the floor, the walls, the ceiling. But there was no one there. No water, no explanation. I backed out of the room, my heart racing. Maybe Steve was playing a prank on me. Maybe he'd come in to mess with the rookie covering his shift. But that didn't make sense. Why would he leave the footprint the cold storage room? At 2:30 a.m. I heard the footsteps. They were soft at first, just a faint coming from somewhere down the hall. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking barefoot on the cold tile. I stared at the monitors, scanning the feeds for any sign of movement. The cameras showed nothing, just empty hallways and silent rooms. The footsteps stopped. And then the doorknob to the office rattled. My breath caught in my throat as the doorknob jiggled violently like someone was trying to force it open. "Who's there?" I shouted, grabbing the baton from my belt. The rattling stopped. I stared at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I reached for the knob and turned it. The hallway was empty. I checked the cameras again, searching for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing. Just the same sterile, lifeless halls. Then the lights in the office went out. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the sudden darkness. The monitors were still on, their faint glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it. On the center monitor, a figure was standing in the hallway. It wasn't clear at first, just a dark shape, blurred and indistinct. But as I watched, it stepped closer to the camera. It was a woman. Her hair was long and matted, her face pale and sunken. She wore a hospital gown, stained and torn, and her bare feet left faint, wet marks on the tile. She stopped in front of the camera, her head tilted to one side as if she were staring directly at me. Then she smiled. The screen went to static. I bolted from the office, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I stumbled down the hall. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. "This isn't funny!" My words felt hollow, swallowed by the silence. I rounded a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The woman was standing at the end of the hall, her back to me. She was swaying slightly, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I stepped back, my legs shaking. And then she turned. Her face was wrong. The eyes were too large, too dark, like empty sockets. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, curling into a grotesque grin. She started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, her bare feet slapping against the tile. I backed away, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled. "Stay back!" I yelled, holding up the baton like it would do any good. She kept coming. I turned and ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the stairwell, slamming the heavy door shut behind me. The silence was deafening. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, the cold steel of the baton slick in my trembling hand. And then I heard it, a faint whisper just behind me. "Why did you leave me?" I don't remember much after that. When the morning staff arrived, they found me sitting in the stairwell shaking and muttering to myself. They said the cameras didn't show anything unusual, no woman, no footsteps. But I know what I saw, and I know one thing for sure, I'll never work a night shift again. This happened to me 10 years ago, but I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Some things burn themselves into your memory so deeply that time can't erase them. I was working as a janitor back then, and the morgue was just one of my assigned buildings. It wasn't a job I wanted, it was a job I needed. Bills were piling up and the pay was decent. Besides, it was easy. I was supposed to clean the offices, hallways, and break rooms. The cold storage and autopsy rooms, off limits. Most nights were uneventful. I'd mop floors, empty trash bins, and vacuum carpets. Then I'd finish with a cigarette in the parking lot and go home. But one night, everything changed. I started my shift at 10 p.m. like usual. The morgue was quiet as always, too quiet. You know how some places just feel wrong? The morgue had that energy, like the silence wasn't natural, like it was waiting for something to break it. I got to work starting with the offices. By midnight, I was halfway done. That's when I noticed it. The door to cold storage was slightly open. I froze. That door was never left open. It had an automatic lock, and the staff were careful about keeping it secure. But tonight it stood ajar, the light from inside casting a faint glow onto the hallway floor. At first I thought maybe someone had forgotten to shut it properly. Then I remembered. I was the only person here. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to check it out or just ignore it. My curiosity won. "Hello?" I called, stepping toward the door. My voice echoed down the hall, but no one answered. I pushed the door open a little wider, just enough to peek inside. The room was cold, so cold my breath misted in front of me. The air smelled like bleach and something metallic, like pennies. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each one labeled with a number. They were all closed. The room was empty. I felt silly for being so jumpy. I told myself the door must have malfunctioned, shrugged it off and closed it. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. A click. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of one of the drawers unlatching. Slowly, I turned back, my heart pounding. One of the drawers near the middle of the wall had slid open just an inch. I stared at it, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe the latch was loose, maybe the cold air caused it to expand. But then it slid open farther. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. The drawer came to a stop, halfway open, and the room fell silent again. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run out of that morgue and never come back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly, I stepped closer, peering into the drawer. It was empty. I shut the drawer and practically ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my cleaning cart and headed for the break room. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "It's just your imagination." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By 1 a.m. I was in the main hallway mopping the floor near the reception desk. The sound of the mop sloshing in the bucket was comforting. It gave me something to focus on. Then I heard the footsteps. At first I thought it was just the building settling, but the sound was too deliberate. Slow, heavy steps echoed down the hall, coming from the direction of the cold storage room. I gripped the mop handle tightly, my pulse quickening. "Is someone there?" I called out. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned back to my work, I felt it, a cold breeze like someone had walked past me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shadow at the far end of the hall. It was gone before I could focus on it, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. At 2:30 a.m., things got worse. I was cleaning the break room when I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal. It was loud, sharp, and close. It came from the cold storage room. I didn't want to go back there. I wanted to leave the mop, the bucket, everything and run. But my curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the tile. The cold storage door was open again, the light spilling out into the hallway. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. All the drawers were open, every single one. The room felt colder than before, the frost creeping up the walls like veins. My flashlight flickered, the beam casting shaky shadows across the room, and then I heard it. A voice. "Why are you here?" It was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the cold like a knife. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the walls. There was no one there. The door slammed shut behind me and the light above flickered violently. Panic set in. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the metal. The voice came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have come." I turned back to the room, my flashlight barely working now. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, its outline hazy and indistinct like smoke trapped in a human shape. Its head tilted to one side and I swear I saw it smile. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, too terrified to move. The figure stepped closer, the air growing impossibly cold. "Leave," it whispered, "before it's too late." The next thing I remember is waking up in the reception area, lying on the floor. The sun was just starting to rise and the building was bathed in soft, golden light. The cold storage door was closed, the drawers were shut, everything looked normal. I quit that day. I didn't tell my boss what happened. I didn't even collect my final paycheck. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that morgue. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that I've never gone back. And I never will. What about you? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Good nightmares and stay scared.